Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History from Monday, 6 January 2025. What is human destiny? This is one of the big questions of speculative philosophy of history, like asking about the meaning of history. If destiny is teleology, and this teleology of the species confers meaning on the human condition, on all our struggles and all our wayward efforts, then the question of historical destiny is the same as the question of historical meaning. But there are philosophers who maintain that purpose and meaning are to be kept strictly separate, in which case the question of human destiny can be considered in isolation from the question of the meaning of history. Hannah Arendt, for example, insisted on distinguishing meaning and purpose and wrote of meanings being degraded into ends. For such a complex question, we do nevertheless have some one-liner answers to the question of human destiny. And one of these one-liners is that demographics is destiny. Auguste Comte is credited for being the first person to say demography is destiny. Despite many references to this, no one cites a source, and I can't myself find it in Comte. But even if it doesn't appear in this explicitly sententious form in Comte, it's implicit throughout his works. Comte also said, quote, "The only real life is the collective life of the race. Individual life has no existence except as an abstraction," unquote. This is the antithesis of Carlyle's great man theory of history and of Sidney Hook's indeterminism, in which the individual can exercise his agency to shape history. But Comte's position agrees in essence with Henri Pirren's insistence that human actions are historical only as they are related to collective movements or in the measure to which they have influenced the collectivity, Pirren said. If it's true that demography is destiny, then demographics is a key to philosophy of history, which in its speculative form has always been interested in destiny. And the destiny of the whole of humanity, and not merely of one people or another, could have a meaning as a whole, like the meaning of the whole of history that I discussed in my episode on the coronation of Charlemagne. According to Comte, demographics is the method to discover our destiny. So, what does a demographic history of humanity reveal? For most of our history, and by our history, I mean human history, there were millions of us at most, with the exception of the earliest and the most recent times. As for the earliest times, when Homo sapiens speciated, which is sometimes called anthropogenesis, the numbers of the new species would have been very small. Only the success of that original human population meant that these numbers grew. But there were some setbacks in the growth of the human numbers along the way. There seems to have been at least two, if not more than two, major bottlenecks in human population in prehistory. A 2023 paper, Genomic Inference of a Severe Human Bottleneck During the Early to Middle Pleistocene Transition, argued for a reduction of our ancestral population to about 1,280 breeding individuals between 930,000 and 813,000 years ago. So that's a very low number. That's human beings existing only in a little more than 1,000. And the bottleneck itself lasted on this estimate for 117,000 years. So for more than 100,000 years of human history, more than 10 times the total historical duration of civilization, there were way less than 1 million of us. Any time during that bottleneck, the remaining human population could have been finished off by some local event, and our lineage would have been extinct forever. This bottleneck occurred after the use of stone tools by our ancestors, but before the use of fire by our ancestors and before modern human beings, Homo sapiens, evolved. So I'm using human very loosely here to include predecessor species in the human lineage. This loose usage of whom we regard as human involves a lot of ambiguity. To really do justice to this early population bottleneck almost a million years ago, we would need to estimate the numbers of all species of the genus Homo at the time. And I don't know if this work has been done, but it would be a major scientific research project that would define the careers of a generation or more of physical anthropologists. Another bottleneck of sorts seems to have recurred more recently after the speciation of Homo sapiens. And for some time, this population bottleneck was associated with the eruption of Mount Toba, sometimes called the Toba super eruption, sometimes called the Toba super volcano, which occurred about 74,000 years before present. The idea was that the eruption resulted in a severe volcanic winter, and this climatic disruption adversely affected human populations and constituted a major selection event in human history. Now the evidence is mixed on the Mount Toba theory, and there's more skepticism about the Mount Toba eruption being the cause of the population bottleneck. But from genetic evidence, we do know that there was a severe human population bottleneck about 70,000 years before present, whatever its cause was. When there's a population bottleneck, this is followed by a founder effect. The genes of those who survive are represented in the population that rebounds, and genes not in the founding population are culled by that bottleneck. In other words, population bottlenecks have a selective effect, and that means it's likely that these population bottlenecks and subsequent founder effects shaped human evolution. Our numbers as a species have mostly only grown since that time, but even apart from severe population bottlenecks like these two prehistoric population bottlenecks, there were further episodes and limits to the number of human beings. Hunter-gatherers don't usually have more children than they can carry. So children are usually nursed for several years until they are capable of walking on their own, and this reduces fertility. Only then would further children be possible, since our earlier ancestors had a much shorter lifespan than we have today. That means there weren't many children born. If you delay the period of time between children and you don't live that many years, you're not going to have too many children. Once our ancestors had expanded throughout every biome on Earth, like most apex predators, they naturally assumed a stable equilibrium with their prey species. And so it was for more than 100,000 years of our hunter-gatherer past. There were millions of us spread all over the entire planet except for Antarctica, and kept in check by slow rates of reproduction and natural checks to the population. There were still animals that predated on human beings, obviously, at that time. And human technology up to that time didn't seriously change the balance between humanity as an apex predator and our prey species. However, it did allow for human beings to adapt themselves to every terrestrial biome, especially the use of the bone needle for sewing form-fitting clothing, the use of canoes to travel along the shore, and the use of missile weapons like throwing spears or the atlatl and the bow and arrow, which were eventually made much more effective with obsidian and other stone arrowheads. The one important exception to this, maintaining an equilibrium balance and having human numbers governed by essentially the equations that govern an apex predator in an ecosystem, the important exception to that was what we call the megafaunal extinctions of the late Pleistocene, starting about 50,000 years ago. These were probably the result of human beings using more advanced hunting technologies like the throwing spear and the bow and arrow. Also, the use of dogs in hunting was a devastating combination. Now, our current research, I think, puts the domestication of dogs about 15,000 years before present, but of course, they might have been dogs might have been domesticated 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years before that, and we just don't have the evidence for it. But a variety of new technologies, including the domestication of dogs, led to much more efficient human hunting, and all the megafauna like of the late Pleistocene went extinct. So even though megafauna like the woolly mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, and the cave bear all went extinct, smaller prey species survived. I think the cutoff line was about 80 pounds, and above that, it was very rare for a species to survive. Obviously, mountain lions are larger than 80 pounds, and they or their ancestors survived. But in generally, most prey species under 80 pounds survived the late Pleistocene extinctions of megafauna. And with these smaller prey species, which we continued to hunt, the human populations of hunter-gatherers achieved carrying capacity on the lands where they wandered, and they can be described by the same equations that we use, more or less, to describe the carrying capacity of any biome for its apex predators. With the introduction of settled agriculturalism, larger families became possible because of a predictable food supply from agriculture, the ability to store foods when sedentary, and the reduced need to restrict population to the number of children who can be carried or who can walk on their own. Agricultural civilizations increased in sophistication over thousands of years. But even these innovations involved intrinsic limits on the expansion of the human population. We know that the Roman population declined severely in the later years of the empire, for example, and it took almost 1,000 years for the population in Europe to recover the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But by the beginning of the 14th century, Europe was bringing marginal lands into cultivation to try to feed itself, and there were several famines in the early 14th century. The Roman population decline and the medieval population recovery were regional events around the Mediterranean and in Europe. But in the middle of the 14th century, starting in 1348 in Europe, another planetary scale population bottleneck occurred, though not as severe as the two prehistoric events. Rather than humanity being reduced to a few thousand individuals as with the prehistoric population bottlenecks, our numbers were reduced by a quarter or a third. In some areas, as many as half of the populations died, and many villages were depopulated and abandoned. It might not be strictly accurate to call this a population bottleneck, but it did leave a genetic mark on the surviving populations. And it was one of the many events that made the populations of the old world resilient to infectious diseases, which in turn led to the virgin soil epidemics in the Americas when the Europeans arrived, bringing old world diseases to the population of the Americas who had no resistance to them at all. These are the kinds of events that I mentioned in my episode on William McNeill, and which he focused on in his book, Plagues and Peoples. With the advent of modernity, human numbers began to increase, and this was the result of many factors. More sophisticated methods of agriculture in particular were significant. The British agricultural revolution, starting in the 17th century, involved better methods of selective breeding, the use of seed drills, and the development of crop rotation. Crop rotation added fodder crops that restore nitrogen to the soil and thus avoid the need to leave a third of cultivated acreage to lie fallow each year, which was all throughout the medieval period. It was common to leave a third of your acreage fallow and just grow nothing on it so it could recover and then be used. And you would rotate the fallow pasture. So you would always have 2/3 of your acreage under cultivation, but a lot of it was not under cultivation because of that. The development of scientific medicine made a major contribution to human longevity, and the Industrial Revolution eventually brought more sophisticated technology both to scientific medicine and to agriculture. Since the British Agricultural Revolution, like the later Industrial Revolution, began in England, population numbers began to rise to historically unprecedented numbers, first of all in England. And so it was first in England that this rise in population drew the attention of philosophers and economists, and those who were both philosophers and economists, like the Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus. And Malthus formulated the classic population thought experiment. Almost everyone has heard of Malthus because his name has become an adjective. But unfortunately, Malthus is almost universally misunderstood today. His 19th century presuppositions about the human condition are not the presuppositions that we bring to discussions of the human condition today. Malthus argued that populations increase until they are limited by naturally occurring checks on that increase. For plants and animals, these natural checks to populations were limited by natural resources and what ecologists would call denudations, when there's a big storm that just wipes everything clean. I mentioned in an earlier, just earlier, that human beings before the advent of civilization were essentially governed by the same population equations that govern other apex predators, and they would have human beings at that time would have been subject to the same natural checks to population. But Malthus introduces a different class of population checks to human beings, and so for human beings, the checks to populations are what Malthus calls misery and vice. Malthus wrote, quote, "The germs of existence contained in this spot of earth, with ample food and ample room to expand in, would fill millions of worlds in the course of a few thousand years. Necessity, that imperious, all-pervading law of nature, restrains them within the prescribed bounds. The race of plants and the race of animals shrink under this great restrictive law, and the race of man cannot, by any efforts of reason, escape from it. Among plants and animals, its effects are waste of seed, sickness, and premature death. Among mankind, misery and vice. The former, misery, is an absolutely necessary consequence of it. Vice is a highly probable consequence, and we therefore see it abundantly prevail, but it ought not perhaps to be called an absolutely necessary consequence." Unquote. The most familiar part of Malthus' argument is that food supply can only be increased linearly, or by an arithmetical ratio, adding a little more productive capacity each year, while population can increase exponentially, or by a geometrical ratio, and the geometrical increase in population must eventually exceed the arithmetical increase in food supply. This is supposed to lead to a Malthusian catastrophe when population exceeds food supply. There's a large literature devoted to the question as to why no Malthusian catastrophe occurred when human population spiked in the 20th century. And in this literature, we find all kinds of explanations as to why Malthus was wrong. All of these explanations are made by people who didn't bother to read Malthus, because Malthus told us very clearly what he meant, and Malthus wasn't wrong. A Malthusian catastrophe occurred, but we didn't notice it. We are living today in a post-Malthusian catastrophe world, whether we know it or not. So Malthus said that the checks to human population growth are misery and vice. Quote, "It is difficult to conceive any check to population which does not come under the description of some species of misery and vice. And he said quite clearly what he meant by misery and vice, which included famine and, well, I should say misery includes famine, mass starvation, urbanization, quote, the unwholesomeness of towns to which some persons are necessarily driven from the nature of their trades, unquote, the want of proper and sufficient food, hard labor, unwholesome habits, sickly seasons, and pestilence. And in the vice column, he includes birth control, luxury, vicious gratifications such as drinking, gambling, and debauchery, violence, oppression, falsehood, rapine, and murder. So, despite or because of Malthus's conception of misery and vice, we could say that Malthus was something of a moral utopian, since he wrote, quote, the ordeal of virtue is to resist all temptation to evil. And Malthus' solution to the human population problem was virtue. But given Malthus' list of miseries and vices, we see that this is what came true. It's just that while it came true, birth control and living in cities no longer came to be considered vice and misery, respectively. So for Malthus, mass starvation was could almost say a moral equivalent of living in cities and birth control. And that isn't a judgment that most people would make today. But because Malthus was living in a different moral world than we are, this was misery and vice, and this is what happened, and this is why we live in a post-Malthusian catastrophe world. Humanity chose misery over vice, humanity chose misery and vice over virtue. We may not see it that way, but Malthus would definitely have seen it that way. He predicted misery and vice, and that's what he would see in our world today. What Malthus would have a difficult time understanding is how we don't interpret our world as an expression of misery and vice in the same way that he would. The difficulty of conceptualizing a different world than we inhabit, and especially the difficulty of conceptualizing a different moral world than we inhabit, brings me to one of the thought experiments I want to pose to you today. Everything up to this point has been mere prelude, but to set up the thought experiment, I had to talk about human population history. So let's do a little social science thought experiment now. Say you are an 18th century gentleman, and all of your friends are Enlightenment bros who are true believers in science and reason. They even wear those cool tri-cornered hats of the period. Not only are you an Enlightenment gentleman who's made the grand tour, you're also a time traveler, so you've seen what's coming in the next couple hundred years. So you make up two population charts for your friends. In chart one, we have an actual representation of the 20th century spike in population, which is completely historically unprecedented. The second chart is a fake chart that shows a reasonable linear extrapolation of population trends in the 18th century. You show these two charts to your friends and ask them which one is the likely future of the population. Which graph of population growth is more plausible, hence intrinsically credible? Which graph would you choose if you knew nothing of the history of the 20th century? What reason would anyone have to choose a future of exponential population increase? There was no reason at all to believe this in the 18th century. Other than actually seeing the unprecedented population future of the 20th century, that is to say, other than showing it, there would be hardly any way to explain to your Enlightenment friends what was coming that would make it sound at all plausible. I can imagine myself trying to explain it, but I can also imagine when I was trying to explain it, being faced with skepticism and incredulity because I would be asking my friends to believe something that had never happened before in the history of the world. What I would be showing them with the 20th century population graph would be an extraordinary claim about the future. And according to Carl Sagan, I ought to be expected to produce extraordinary evidence to back up this extraordinary claim. And certainly if I was a time traveler, maybe I could do that. Maybe I could take them to the future with me, but then that would be showing them and not explaining to them. In the 20th century, the number of human beings hit an inflection point that has taken us up to almost 8 billion. This was largely the result of modern medical science, which greatly reduced childhood mortality, and the ability of mechanized agriculture to produce greater quantities of food. As a consequence, today we live in an age of peak population. We haven't yet quite reached the peak, but it's coming. Population numbers seem to still be increasing at present, but the rate of increase is slowing, with the most highly industrialized parts of the world already experiencing negative growth of the native populations. It seems likely that the planetary populations will peak at around 9 or 10 billion in the later part of the present century. These population numbers of peak population aren't sustainable and will eventually fall. But for better or worse, we today live in an age of peak population. So what comes next? How will a declining population shape the human future? It might help to explain this question by asking how a rapidly expanding population shaped history, kind of like a mirror image symmetry of, if population, if we were going to try to imagine what population decline is going to do to civilization, what did population increase due to civilization? How have the sheer numbers of humanity of peak population shaped our culture? So this is our second thought experiment today, but in the form of a counterfactual. I guess you could call the other one a counterfactual too, because I asked you to imagine your time travel or showing your 18th century bros what the 20th century population is going to be like. But in this counterfactual, we will imagine a history in which the spike in human population happened. In other words, imagine the second graph that I explained earlier, where you have a linear extrapolation of population and no major dramatic population inflection in the 20th century. So no megacities, no conurbations, no teeming masses of humanity in the 20th century. This would be a world in which the Industrial Revolution never happened, or in which it happened much more slowly as an industrial evolution, since it was population that mostly drove the application of technology as solutions to human problems. And these were problems created by sheer human numbers. Let's take a narrower focus to bring some clarity to this thought experiment. Imagine a world sans peak population through the familiar lens, through the familiar styles of art that developed throughout the inflection in human population. Most of the aesthetic movements of the modern world have been bound up with social movements. So in our thought experiment, we have to try to imagine Impressionism, Art Nouveau, Art Deco, the Successionists, and the Cubists without the social changes wrought by population, technology, and industrialization. That is to say, we have to try to imagine modern history without mass man. We can try to imagine this, but in the attempt to imagine it, we see that this world would have been radically different from the world that we know. We have to try to imagine the Gibson girl taken out of the context of a rapidly expanding US economy at the turn of the previous century, the Gilded Age with its railroads and robber barons and conspicuous consumption. This example might perhaps not be too difficult, but there are cases in which the difficulty becomes greater. Monet painted a famous picture of the Gare Saint-Lazare, which was a major railway station thronged with passengers, but those passengers would never have materialized because the crowds would never have materialized because the population spike uh, never happened. So the Gare Saint-Lazare was probably never built in this counterfactual, and there wouldn't have been there for Monet to paint. William Powell Frith's famous painting of Paddington Station is probably a better example of crowds, though Frith is better known for genre scenes, sort of like a Victorian Hogarth, than for pioneering a distinctive style of art. All the same, I could say that the naive realism of Frith was eminently suited to the new industrial age as an art of the masses for the masses. But what would Frith have painted without the masses of Paddington Station? Well, he would have been maybe he would have done Hogarth over, and we would have a Victorian version of the Rake's Progress, which would be cool, I have to admit. The urban anxiety and deracination exhibited in Cubism would not have had the same rebellious, angry edge in a world without cities bloated from industrialization. Picasso might have painted bucolic landscapes instead, and his blue period might have been blue cows, blue pigs, blue goats, and blue sheep. The lonely cities of Edward Hopper, with alienated individuals staring out the windows, would have been intimate small towns where everyone knows everyone else. So are the styles of art that have defined modernity and defined the modern human condition and the modern human experience mere artifacts of industrialization? I think they were in part artifacts of industrialization, but I don't think they were only that. In other words, I wouldn't employ a reductivist explanation, although I'd certainly let industrialization play a role in an explanation of artistic styles of the 20th century. There were stylistic changes in art before and after the Black Death, when population crashed by a quarter to a third in just a couple of years, which in historical terms is the blink of an eye. It would have been an incredibly traumatic thing to live through. Barbara Tuchman wrote, speaking of the population crash caused by the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century, quote, amid depopulation and disaster, extravagance and splendor were never more extreme, unquote. And we could well possibly see that in a future depopulation. But the coming population crash that will follow the coming population spike and peak population isn't going to happen quickly. It certainly isn't going to happen in a couple of years like the Black Death. It's going to unfold over several generations, but it's going to be every bit as brutal as the population spike has been, with the possible exception being that there will be less reason to fight over what resources are available because falling populations will mean less pressure on natural resources, land, and housing. Depending on how deep and how sustained the coming population crash will be, whether it will be a catastrophic crash or more like a soft landing, we can imagine many scenarios of how it might play out. When the fertility crisis really hits, population plummets, and all the housing stock built over the past few decades starts to empty out, we can imagine a time when people die in their high-rise apartments and the bodies are never found because no one goes into the buildings anymore. And we can imagine further scenarios in the future when the population crash is followed by a population recovery. So that maybe in some future population boom, when population numbers start to recover again, urban archaeologists will find these lonely skeletons in their beds, or perhaps they'll find bodies mummified by air conditionings in apartments that were effective time capsules like sealed Egyptian tombs. This kind of population crash would utterly change the world. But it's very difficult for us to say exactly what those changes will be. The fact that civilization endured for thousands of years when human numbers were still in the millions and not yet in the billions suggests that the remnant population following the crash will possibly be able to carry on with civilization, but we have no guarantee of this at all. It's been interesting to me to see how the mouse utopia experiments by John B. Calhoun in the 60s were brought back to life again as talking points on the internet. It's a classic experiment, so it's good to see it return to discussion. But if you search around, you can find endless blog posts and videos and podcasts about the mouse utopia experiment. Unlike the equally famous Stanford prison experiment, the mouse utopia experiment was allowed to run and be repeated several times and went to its actual termination, which the Stanford prison experiment never did, and always with the same result, which is a pretty grim thing to look at. In the mouse utopia experiments, mice were given plenty of food and water and a reasonably comfortable enclosure. The one limit placed on the mice was space. The space of the mouse utopia experiment was fixed from the start, and it didn't change throughout the course of the experiment. In every run of the experiment, mouse populations expanded rapidly, hit a peak, and then crashed. And they didn't just crash to lower numbers, they crashed to extinction. Even when mouse population numbers began to fall, the mice had ceased to reproduce, and the changed conditions didn't change their behavior. Our own human utopia experiment is being carried out within the limits of the terrestrial biosphere. This isn't an absolute limit, but it's what we would call a natural limit for human expansion. Human expansion beyond Earth may be possible, but it requires advanced technology and a robust industrialized infrastructure. Let's suppose that what happened to the mice in their experiment doesn't precisely happen with human beings in our own utopian experiment, and that despite the population crash, some remnant of the human population continues, and that science, technology, and industry can continue in development, even if at a smaller scale and at a slower pace. The population crash will likely deleteriously affect our industrial infrastructure. And this is a problem for space exploration, expansion, and settlement, as space exploration involves technology that is difficult, demanding, and very expensive to build. In a severe population crash, we could lose enough of our industrial infrastructure that our ability to engage in space exploration is nullified. We're going to suppose in the next thought experiment that the contraction of industry doesn't permanently cripple space exploration, so that either these technologies are retained or they are able to recover within a reasonable period of time. Our third thought experiment will involve human off-world migration. Populations on Earth have spiked up and now seem to be poised to crash later in this century, but the space environment will be a frontier. And the kind of pioneers who are drawn to a frontier may have a higher birth rate than populations on Earth. The human population in space will be highly selective, no matter how broadly a political attempt is made to distribute it among the population. And that is for physical and biological reasons. The first human communities in space will effectively be a new founder population. So the founder effect that I talked about earlier in relation to earlier prehistoric population events, bottlenecks, I should say. So there will be a founder effect. The initial population in space will pass along its genes, which will mean that the genes of this selective population will be disproportionately represented in subsequent generations of human beings in space. We can imagine an alternative scenario in which ongoing migration from Earth will expand the genetic pool of humanity in space, making it less selective and the founder effect less pronounced. We don't know what space settlement will do to fertility, but we can't rule out the possibility that human population will grow off planet, even while the human population on Earth is shrinking or stable. In zero gravity environments, there are catastrophic consequences for human health, but it may be possible to build large artificial environments that can be spun to simulate gravity. Since this hasn't been done yet, we don't know how well this will work, but we can make a prediction. And this prediction is that given the natural genetic diversity leading to individual variation, it seems likely that some human beings will tolerate this substitution for gravity and some will not tolerate it as well. This is a pure genetic lottery. Until we build the settlements and put people on them, we don't know who will get sick and who will be perfectly fine. We don't know who will have high fertility rates and who will effectively be rendered sterile. But individual variation coupled with a selective environment are the drivers of natural selection. This is what creates evolution. This is what is responsible for speciation, and it isn't going to stop with human beings going on into space. In other words, simulated gravity will be a further selective effect, further narrowing the pool of those who can successfully reproduce in space, and therefore magnifying the founder effect of those populations that are able to reproduce in space. For plants, greenhouses can be built that optimize growing conditions. Artificial habitats in space could also be built to optimize conditions for human beings, making them even better conditions for human populations to thrive as compared to Earth. Given optimal conditions for human reproduction optimized in artificial environments in space, we're faced with an interesting question. What is or what would be an optimal human population? We can arrive at Earth's optimal carrying capacity for human beings by adding several assumptions to our existing ecological understanding of the carrying capacity of each biome within the biosphere for apex predators, adjusting for the level of technology available and the way of life that is expected by those populations. If the way of life for the population is approximately what would be called civilized, then this entails certain demands on the environment and natural resources, and this in turn would give us the number of persons that can be sustainably supported by a given environment. And we could call this the civilizational carrying capacity of a planet. If we decided to move the entirety of human civilization into space and leave only a remnant population of hunter-gatherers on Earth, the carrying capacity of hunter-gatherers would be much, much lower than the carrying capacity for a civilized population, since hunter-gatherers require much more space per person. They also require that their prey species be able to reproduce at a rate at which they can sustain the population of predators. A planet's civilizational carrying capacity is distinct from its ecological carrying capacity without the usual manifestations of civilization, by which I mean settled agriculturalism, cities, and industry in some form or another. But if human beings can live away from Earth, the natural limits of Earth cease to apply. Under these conditions, the optimal human population becomes a different question. Given the possibilities of human life in artificial habitats, extremely high human populations would be possible, in which these large populations would have no impact on the terrestrial biosphere. With the natural biospheric limit removed, and resources of space being as abundant as they are, the upper bound of human population would be set by the limits of the universe, which for all practical purposes is no limit at all for human beings. A human population of several billion is a lot for a single planet, and it still might be a lot of people for a single planetary system. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. Given that there are already 8 billion people on Earth, and that the civilizational carrying capacity of the solar system is many times that of Earth alone, given the appropriate technologies, how is 8 billion people a lot of people for the solar system? So imagine now, another thought experiment. Imagine that half of humanity left Earth and moved to artificial settlements in the solar system. That would mean about 4 billion people on Earth and about 4 billion people elsewhere in the solar system. 4 billion people is a lot of people living in space, a number that is scarcely imaginable today. 4 billion people living in habitats of 10,000 persons each would be 400,000 habitats. It would take 1 million habitats of this size to house the entire population of Earth. Now, the solar system has the resources to produce those, but the actual production of them would be a monumental undertaking that would dwarf anything that human beings have done before in their history. It would be as unprecedented as the 20th century spike in human population. There's nothing that you could compare to it. Even given this effort, the density of persons in the solar system would be very low. And as I said, the carrying capacity of the solar system is no doubt much, much greater. But the effort involved is so monumental, it's hard to imagine it even coming around. With a founding population of only 25,000 individuals and a growth rate of 2%, after 500 years, this yields a total population of 498 million and some. So 500 million people. So this is different than the scenario of moving half of Earth's population in space. You only need to put 25,000 people in space and leave them to reproduce at a 2% growth rate, and you've got 500 million people in space, which is a lot, but it's not nearly as many as 4 billion people in space as in the previous thought experiment. With a founding population of only 10,000 individuals and a growth rate of 3%, if you can, optimize the habitats for reproduction, after 500 years, this yields a population of more than 26 billion people, several times Earth's current population, and higher than any future Earth population is ever likely to be. Not impossible, but it's a very, very high population. If these 26 billion persons work at constructing new artificial environments in space, these populations could rise exponentially for far longer than population has risen exponentially on Earth. 26 billion individuals would be a very high population, but if these 26 billion people were spread out into the galaxy, they would be very thin on the ground indeed. At a much larger scale than the solar system, a human population distributed among the hundreds of billions of stars in the Milky Way galaxy would be a small and an almost insignificant population. The civilizational carrying capacity of the Milky Way would be in the hundreds of trillions or more. It could be calculated, but I didn't bother to even attempt a back of the envelope calculation. In the big picture of human demography, this may be what matters. So, if in a comparison of human terrestrial and extraterrestrial human populations, we can imagine the human population from its beginning to its eventual ultimate end on Earth as a bell curve. We start with the speciation of Homo sapiens. That population rises to its peak, and then it declines, and eventually human beings on Earth go extinct. So we're not yet at peak population, but we are getting there. So we're still on the upward slope of the bell curve. But eventually, we end up on the other side in the very long term, more than 1 billion years or more. Earth becomes uninhabitable for large apex predators like ourselves, and not long after, uninhabitable for just about everything. not only will we pass peak population and go into decline, eventually the human population on Earth will be zero. Human beings at that time will be at the very least, locally extinct in both the ecological meaning of local extinction, where a population might be extinct in one geographical area but not in another, and in the cosmological meaning of local, which is right here on our own planet. We will be at that point extinct on our home world. Now suppose a process of what I call extraterrestrialization, and you have an initial founding population that begins when we are at or near the peak of the bell curve population of terrestrial population, in which extraterrestrial human populations are free to grow even as terrestrial populations decline. Eventually, extraterrestrial population will exceed terrestrial population, and further off in the future, once again, extraterrestrial populations can continue to grow even as Earth ceases to be habitable. But all of these things hinge on our ability to master the technology to live in engineered habitats, or our ability to engineer biospheres, which I think the latter will probably be ultimately more difficult than building an artificial habitat. So that's the difference between, on the one hand, making an artificial settlement and attempting terraforming so human beings can live on some other naturally occurring object in somewhere in the universe. And so that's terraforming will have to be a subject for another time. I'm just saying speculatively, I don't think that's going to be as viable as building artificial settlements. What would the quality of life be like for human beings living in artificial environments? In the film Elysium, we have a single, what people who study this kind of thing call a Stanford torus, where we have an idyllic living conditions, which is shown in the film as a social tension between the suffering masses on Earth and the elites living in these beautiful spaces that have been created in this artificial habitat in Earth. So would each, but let me back up a moment. The scenario of the film I mentioned, Elysium, you've got, like I said, this human uh, dynamic between the elites in space and the teeming masses on Earth. It won't necessarily be that way. It could be completely reversed, so that the people remaining on Earth are the elites because quality of life is better, and the people on artificial settlements are the teeming masses that have been exported away from Earth to make it into a paradise. So you can have this go either way if you want. You could do another movie to be the anti-Elysium, showing it the other way around if you wanted. So would each artificial settlement in space be its own little human utopia experiment, parallel to the mouse utopia experiment? I could argue that human life on Earth, in the biosphere in which we evolved, which is our cosmological environment of evolutionary adaptedness, is always going to be better than a life lived in an artificial settlement in space. And for most human beings, this is probably true. But that doesn't rule out the possibility that there may be good lives in artificial settlements in space, lives judged to be better than not existing at all. And I use this language, better than not existing at all, because it's the language that Derek Parfit uses in his book, Reasons and Persons, that he uses in that book for his thought experiment, which we're going to talk about now. For those of you who are listening and not looking at the video version of this, I'm displaying on the screen an illustration from Parfit's book, in which we have a bunch of rectangles that represent the human population. And there's four scenarios here. And to back up once again a little, with the possibility of human lives both on Earth and in space, and the possibility that these lives may be of unequal value, we have a perfect setup to think concretely about what Derek Parfit called the repugnant conclusion, and which is also called the paradox of mere addition. So in the illustration, like I said, we have rectangles representing population where the width of the rectangle is the population, and the height of the rectangle is how happy the people are. And in A, it's a narrow, long rectangle, so the people are very happy, but there's not so many of them. And in B, it's shorter than A, and it's twice as wide. So it seems obvious that B isn't as good as A because no one in B is as happy as those in A. Everybody is less well off. Although just saying they're less well off is kind of ambiguous because if we compare happiness to being well off, there can be disagreements there. So Parfit presents his paradox in several forms in great detail. So I'm not going to go into the level of detail in the book. You can read the chapter on the repugnant conclusion in his Reasons and Persons. But it goes sort of like this. We've got all these people in A and who are very happy. But then you've got this other scenario, A plus. And in A plus, you've got all the people who are in A who are very happy, but maybe not so many of them. But then you've got a separate population they judge their lives to be, as I said a moment ago, better than not existing. So they want to be alive, but they're not nearly as happy as the people in scenario A. But if you add all these people in A plus people who want to be alive, there's no reason not to prefer that over A. And then in scenario of divided B, you can say that you've got these two populations you bring down the level of A and you increase the level of B, so everybody is better off than the additional population of A plus. And they are you could argue that divided B is just as good as A plus, if not better. And then since divided B is just the same as B all told, then you've got the A and B where you've shown that B is not as good for the population as the A scenario. Like I said, Parfit goes into it in great detail. And if you continue this kind of reasoning, you get a situation like in the second illustration from Parfit's book, which I'm showing now, which has a population A, which is small, but everybody is very happy. And then you've got B, less happy, larger, C, even less happy, even larger, and Z, where you just have minimal people judging their lives to be better than not existing, and a lot of them. So Parfit formulates the repugnant conclusion like this, quote, for any possible population of at least 10 billion people, all with a very high quality of life, there must be some larger imaginable population whose existence, if other things are equal, would be better, even though its members have lives that are barely worth living, unquote. So Parfit is unhappy with this. Our earlier population nightmare was Malthusianism, but our future population nightmare now is the prospect of the repugnant conclusion of teeming masses of people who just barely judge their lives to be worth living, as opposed to a smaller number of people who are very happy. I think Parfit uses the term blissful. Some philosophers place a great store by the repugnant conclusion, or rather upon somehow avoiding the repugnant conclusion. Well-known contemporary Scottish philosopher William MacAskill, who wrote Doing Good Better and What We Owe the Future, mentions that he was a co-signer on a joint letter from 29 philosophers that being able to derive the repugnant conclusion from a theory of population ethics is not in itself reason enough to dismiss a theory. So the idea here is that the repugnant conclusion has come to loom so large that people are just going to abandon any moral theory of, specifically any theory of population ethics that is going to suggest the repugnant conclusion, and they're advising other philosophers not to go that route. This seems a little pointless to me, but leave that aside. I suspect that most of us can agree that a vision of a world of countless billions of lives of marginal value, better than not existing, but not much better than that, is not very inspiring and not something our moral theory should force us to acknowledge as being better than a world of far fewer individuals with admirable, if not enviable, lives. Would the vision of an ambitious spacefaring future be that disturbing vision of countless billions of marginal lives, or would it be something else entirely? With the concrete example I've used as a model for lives that can represent the repugnant conclusion, we can make concrete objections that aren't so readily suggested by considering the problem in the abstract. Parfit himself used a number of imaginative scenarios to illustrate his argument. I'm just using a different imaginative scenario. Since I've given concrete examples of greater and lesser happiness, and I'm using happiness in this context, for lack of a better term, to capture society's self-perception of the value of the lives of its members, it's easier to see this than when the idea is taken in the abstract. So if you imagine the scenario I suggested earlier, where you've got teeming masses of trillions of people potentially in space and artificial habitats, and then you've got a few people allowed to live on a pristine Earth that is now restored to its biospheric, maybe not pristine, but restored to a significant level of biospheric health. Are those additional billions of people in space, is that the better life because there's so many of them that they swamp out the other lives of greater value? But that, once again, saying lives of greater value is ambiguous. Lives of more happiness, more blissful lives, where these teeming billions in artificial habitats aren't having blissful lives, but they are reproducing. Now, what strikes me first and foremost is the whole of Parfit's arguments rest on what we could call the utilitarian fallacy, which is what I call the idea that happiness, which utilitarians also sometimes call utility, can be quantified and summed up like any market commodity. But it can't. The happiness of one person can't be arbitrarily swapped and compared among members of any given population. For one thing, individual human beings have different capacities for happiness. Some people are happy regardless of their circumstances, and some people will never be happy no matter what their life is like. Also, and this is a familiar objection, there are qualitative differences in happiness. This was expressed famously by Jeremy Bentham when he said, quote, "Prejudice apart, the game of pushpin is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry," unquote. We could say that Bentham explicitly committed himself to the utilitarian fallacy. John Stuart Mill, perhaps the most famous utilitarian, took exception to this, but he didn't give a definitive refutation to the argument for the equality of pleasure, and subsequent utilitarianism has wavered on this point. But we can see from arguments like those of Parfit's and others that the idea of the equality of happiness can be assumed even where it's not explicitly stated, and even where a philosopher might try to avoid it. The qualitative differences in happiness, moreover, are related to the individual's capacity for happiness. And I said earlier, I think it's very clear that some people can be happy under any conditions and some people can't be happy under any conditions. Some individuals only have the capacity to enjoy pushpin or some other simple game, like the example I use pushpin because that's Jeremy Bentham's example. And some individuals have the capacity to enjoy both pushpin and poetry. And some individuals might have enjoyed pushpin as a child, but they cease to enjoy it as an adult and they enjoy poetry as an adult. But the measurement of happiness is a large subject that deserves treatment on its own merits. And utilitarianism is also a large and complex topic. As one of the dominant moral theories of our time, I don't want to appear merely to dismiss it. So I'm just going to leave that as what I'm going to say on that for today and pass on to other matters, possibly returning to it in some future episode. So let's return to the possibility of a human expansion on a cosmological scale. And let's take this possibility in the context of past human expansions on Earth. It's repeatedly happened in history that a people pass through a period of great expansion, usually in conjunction with the mastery of a weapon system or a trading infrastructure or both, and then, exhausted by this disproportionate projection of itself out into the world, falls back exhausted and thereafter plays very little role in history. This happened with the Vikings, who developed long ships and a tradition of raiding and trading until they were converted to Christianity. And for a brief period of a little more than 100 years, they expanded rapidly and traded where they could, raided where they could, and were incredibly successful. This happened with the Mongols, who developed a distinctive form of horse archery that was their killer app for a weapon system, you could say, and an internal tolerance within the empire that facilitated trade and commerce. And they also grew very large for a while. This happened with the Portuguese, who created the first truly planetary scale empire, but who by the 20th century had diminished to the point of being almost a third world nation within Europe. And this happened with the British Empire, who exploited their early industrialization advantage to create a planetary scale empire, which they surrendered voluntarily when they got tired of managing their empire. And we could yet see future iterations of this pattern on a much larger scale. And space exploration could be like this for Earth. A small planet that projects itself out into the galaxy in a great outward expansion, but then this expansion can't be sustained, and eventually it falls back in on itself, and human beings decide that they aren't fit for that spectacular future. Like the Mongols withdrawing to Inner Mongolia, the Vikings withdrawing to Scandinavia, the Portuguese withdrawing to Portugal, or the English withdrawing to the British Isles. Humanity as a species may expand dramatically into the cosmos, only to later withdraw to Earth, having spent itself in the effort. Can a civilization overextend itself and recoil in exhaustion from the effort? I think that's what happened in all of these cases. And I think it could happen in a iteration of future history. But formulating a conceptual framework of sufficient sophistication to describe this trajectory of civilization would be the work of a lifetime. The theoretical framework for understanding civilization is so impoverished we don't have a common set of concepts or a common language as a shared framework to discuss the problem that I'm posing. This Shared framework may be available to us in the fullness of time, but only if we actively work on the problem now to frame the rudiments of a study of civilization. But this kind of work has been conspicuous in its absence over the past couple of generations. The last time there was a shared scholarly effort to understand civilization in theoretical terms was in the middle of the 20th century, but the effort petered out, and while the books and papers remain today, they are very little read. And I hope to discuss this in more detail in future episodes on civilization. So, this episode began with a paragraph I wrote back in September. And once I decided to rewrite it as an episode, obviously it grew in the telling and has become something much longer. But even then, I've touched on, in a lot of things, I've only touched on things in passing. So I may choose to break this up into smaller fragments, elaborate those fragments in more detail, and then return to it as a series of talks. But and for the meantime, we have this high level overview summary of the whole subject of human population history as human destiny. And I hope you can accept it for what it's worth. So thanks for listening.